Welcome back once again, everybody. We are going to continue with these week 3 video lectures. And in the last episode, episode 7, we were talking about how to talk about market equilibrium changes. So how to go through the 3 steps and predict what will happen to the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity for a good, Liney's red or whatever, when supply and or demand changed. In this particular episode, episode 8, we're going to talk about situations where the market price is either too high or too low from a societal perspective. So for example, in the market for entry-level workers, the free market, quote unquote, might say that those workers should be paid a wage of $4 an hour. But most of us would look at a wage of $4 an hour and say, are you kidding me? I mean, who in the heck can live on $4 an hour? And so the government is tempted then to step in and put on a price floor, a minimum price allowed by law with respect to wages for entry-level workers. On the other hand, sometimes the market-determined price is too high. And we might say, for example, in terms of rental units, apartments, that the market rent might say it should be, $1,500, $2,000 a month. But a lot of people are like, are you kidding me? I can't afford that. How in the world am I going to find a place to live? And so the government sometimes is tempted to put on a price ceiling and say you can't charge a price above X number of dollars per month for rent. And so the implication or the question is, what are the implications of that economically? When the government intervenes and sets these legal prices, minimums or maximums, the question is what happens? Who wins and who loses? And it also begs the question, are there better ways to try to deal with those really important social issues, like trying to make sure people have enough income to stay out of poverty, trying to make sure that people have access to affordable housing, things that everybody can agree is a good goal. The question is how to get us there. And that's our topic for today, for this particular episode. So I'm going to start by talking about price floors. And as the name indicates, a floor is about as low as we can go, right? I can't go below the floor that I'm standing on right now unless I take the stairs or whatever. But right now I'm supported by that floor. I can be above it, I could jump above it and be above, but I can't be below the floor. So if you want to put a definition down, a price floor is a minimum price allowed by law. So a price floor is a minimum price allowed by law. Minimum price allowed by law. And so we should think about some examples of price floors, and then we'll look at one specific one in some detail. One obvious one that we just chatted about briefly was the minimum wage. Remember that for covered workers in this country, the story is that there's a minimum wage. You can't pay workers below that specified minimum. There are other price floors as well. We're going to look at the minimum wage in detail, so we'll go back to that in just a second. But there are other price floors too. If you think about it, you've probably walked into a convenience store somewhere and you've seen a sign that said lowest legal prices on tobacco or lowest legal prices on cigarettes. And the story is those are price floors. So they have a minimum markup. They're not allowed to charge a price below a certain level by law. It's also the case with gasoline, at least in the state of Wisconsin and some other states that we have what are known as the minimum markup laws. And what that basically says is that for gas, retailers, the convenience stores, the retailers of gasoline must mark up the price of their gas at least 6% over their wholesale price, or 9%, 9 point something percent, I can't remember the specific number, over what it costs for the fuel at their closest terminal. So by doing that, it keeps the prices that we pay higher than what the free market would say. And in case you're wondering, like, why do we have something like a minimum markup law or lowest legal prices for cigarettes, most of it actually goes back to early days of this past century, when there were a lot of small businesses, so-called mom and pop stores, right? And the mom and pop stores were having a hard time competing with the big industries, the big stores. Specifically in the grocery industry, there was a big supermarket chain, the first really supermarket chain in the country, called A&P. And A and P, because of their huge size, their economies of scale, were able to charge a lot lower prices than the small stores. And the mom and pop grocers cried foul, and they contacted their representatives and their legislators or senators, and they said, hey, protect us, right? We need to be able to stay in business and compete. And so one of the things that came out of that was this minimum markup law that said, hey, you've got to increase your price at least this % above your wholesale to try to give the smaller businesses the ability to coexist with the bigger ones. Whether that's right or wrong is a different question, and we can talk about that a little later in the class. But the story is that's where it comes from. So those are some examples. Agricultural price supports are another example of price floors. Some of you may be, on farms or have grown up on farms or whatever, and even if you haven't, you know that there are agricultural price supports. So if market conditions get really bad and prices would go really low, there are programs in place to help elevate the money that farmers get for that product so they can stay in business, effectively putting a floor on or a minimum on the prices they can get for their commodities. Okay? So what we're going to do is look at the impact of a price floor in theory, in the general idea, and then we'll look at minimum wage in some detail. So what's the impact of putting a price floor on in a marketplace? And the answer, and it's my favorite answer in all of economics, is it depends. And it depends upon where that floor is established relative to what the freely operating market would like to see. So for example, I've got the graph drawn over here on the left. And what supply and demand would determine would be the market price. So where supply and demand intersect on your graph, I want you to label the price PM, because that would be the free market price, and QM as the equilibrium quantity. And then suppose that the government looks at that price and says that price is just too low. We need to put on a floor up here, we'll call it PF, and that's the solid line you have going to the right. What the floor says, again, is that by law, the price can't go below that green line. It can't go below that floor. It can be above it, no problem, but it can't be below it by law. Okay? So then the question becomes one of, well, what happens at that artificially high price, at that floor? And if you look at it and say, well, the price can't go below P floor, then what's going to develop is the following. That at PF, that price, the quantity demanded is going to be back here. So the quantity demanded at the floor, QDF, is back there, but the quantity that would be supplied at that higher price is way out here. So the quantity supplied at the floor is out there. And of course, what develops in this market then is excess quantity supplied, or a surplus. Now, the surplus in a free market would get competed away, but it can't here because the law says you can't have a price below P floor. So this surplus is made permanent by the law. And so if you're filling in the blanks underneath that graph, once you've got the graph drawn, when you set a price floor above the market equilibrium price, that's going to lead to a surplus. And that's the first blank, lead to a surplus. And this is shown above as the distance, if you want to write it this way, as the quantity supplied at the floor, QSF, minus the quantity that would be demanded at that artificially high price. So it's this distance, or equivalently, this distance down here. Right? So that is what's going to happen when we put a floor that's above the equilibrium. We're keeping the prices artificially high, and that's leading to less quantity demanded than supplied, or a surplus. Okay? So that's the first answer. The second part of the answer is to say, well, yeah, but what if the floor was below the market price? So let's look at the graph on the top of the next page. Again, I would like you, where supply and demand intersect, to label that as the market price and the market quantity. And then to say, okay, what if the government has a floor established down here? What if by law the price can't go below that red line? What's going to develop in this marketplace? And you might be thinking, well, a shortage is going to develop because the price is artificially low, but the price isn't artificially low here. In fact, what's going to happen is that the law says you can't go below the red line, but you can be above it. And so the actual situation here is that this price floor is non-binding. It's not going to do anything in the market. There will be no shortage or surplus. So if you're filling in the blanks there, there's no shortage or surplus since the market is unaffected. What that means is that the actual equilibrium is going to be right here, right? At the market equilibrium price and quantity. So there's no distortion, no shortage, it doesn't bind, nothing happens. And you might look at something like this, and so if you want to answer the second blank, the actual equilibrium price and quantity will be PM, the market price, and QM, the free market quantity. But nothing's going to develop. And some of you might be scratching your head, figuratively probably, and asking yourself, you know, why would we ever have a situation like this if it doesn't do anything? Well, let me talk very briefly about a minimum wage story, and then we'll actually analyze the impact of the minimum wage in just a minute. So this would be a labor market, right, if we're talking about the minimum wage. And the price would be the wage, and the quantity would be, you know, the level of employment, the number of workers and the number of jobs, right? And so the minimum wage right now, the price floor is currently $7.25 per hour for most workers. There's different minimums for people that are, you know, under the age of 18. There's different minimums for people who are in their first, you know, X number of days of employment. You know, yes, the you know, servers get a lower minimum, but then tips are supposed to make it up to at least $7.25, and if they don't, the employer is by law supposed to make up the difference. So if you're in one of those businesses where that's not happening, think about that, right? They definitely should be paying. You should be earning at least $7.25 an hour. But the story is it's $7.25, right? And so in some markets, this is the effect. That is that, you know, I'm from Iowa County, Wisconsin. Mineral Point is my hometown. Go Pointers. Wrestling capital of Southwest Wisconsin, usually. But the story is that and that's a market where there's not a lot of demand, because there's not a lot of employers, and the supply of labor is relatively unskilled, not a lot of high education down there. And so the story is that the market might say the going wage would be $5 an hour. In that situation, right, with a minimum says you can't pay $5, you got to pay at least $7.25. What's going to develop is a surplus of labor. In other words, at $7.25 an hour, more people want to work, want to supply their labor than will be demanded by the employers, because the employers are the demanders of labor, and we will see a surplus develop. On the other hand, right, think about a market that's really strong in the labor situation like Madison. You know, the floor is the minimum wage of $7.25. But it's pretty hard during good times in Madison to get anybody to work in those entry-level jobs for under $8, maybe $8.50 an hour. What does that tell me? It says that in Madison, the $7.25 minimum really doesn't have any teeth. Right? What are people going to get paid in Madison for these entry-level jobs? $8. They're not going to get paid $7.25. You can't get enough workers at $7.25. You got to pay them $8. That's what the market demands. Remember that the floor, sometimes students struggle with this, it's just a minimum price. It's not the mandated price. You don't have to pay $7.25 an hour. You just can't pay any less than that. And so in this situation, there's no effect. Over here, when the floor is greater than the market wage or the market price, we definitely have a permanent surplus, and we have that distortion. Okay? So what I want to do is erase a little bit of this, specifically the graph on the right here, and then talk a little bit about the minimum wage in some detail. A little bit of its history, a little bit about analyzing the impact and whether it's a good way to fight poverty or if there are better ways. So let's do that. And to start off, I just want to think about the history of the minimum wage. And it was first established as a federal minimum in 1938 with a piece of legislation called the Fair Labor Standards Act. And you don't need to know that act. But it was established in the 30s like so many of the protective labor laws of our country. Social Security Act was passed in the 30s, unemployment comp, or unemployment insurance, workers' comp. Unions were allowed to form legally for the first time with the Wagner Act in the 30s. So all those things happened because of the Great Depression and the belief that maybe capitalism needs to be reined in because there were lots of limits on how everybody would fare. And so those laws were passed. In 1938, the federal minimum was set at 25 cents an hour. And 25 cents an hour was worth more than 25 cents today. And so if you adjust it for inflation, that's equivalent to a little over $4, about $4.15 or so per hour in today's dollars. Okay. Now in Wisconsin, that minimum wage is also $7.25. States can have minimums that are above the federal, and several states do, but you can't have a minimum that's below the federal. And if you do, then the federal one dominates. The federal one wins. Whichever is higher is the one that will be binding by law. Our federal, and for that matter, state minimum wages were actually federal was last raised, if you're answering Part C there, in 2009. And, there's a lot of talk out there today and every year about should we raise it more? Should we pay fast food workers $15 an hour? It's been a big topic lately. Should we, because a living wage, quote unquote, the wage you'd have to earn if you were a full-time 40-hour-a-week worker in order to be able to afford, a basic apartment and all that kind of stuff in Madison is close to $15, $16, $17 an hour. And so obviously the story of $7.25 with one job isn't going to cut it. You got two-income household, maybe a little close to that, but the story is it's a rough go. So people are calling some people for raising it, and we're going to analyze what the impact of that might be, good and bad, in just a second. Just real quick at the bottom there, one thing to think about is that raising the minimum wage is one tool that a lot of folks advocate in order to try to reduce poverty. But I just give you the numbers here. If you were a full-time minimum wage worker, $7.25 per hour times 40 hours per week times 52 weeks per year, right? The story is your annual income, if you do that simple math, would be, you're filling in the blank, $15,080. $15,080. That's the same at the federal level and Wisconsin right now because the minimum wages at both are $7.25 currently. That's actually above the poverty line for a family of one. And we'll talk a little bit more about the poverty line in the coming weeks. But the story is that it's still very, very low income indeed as a minimum wage worker. So I've got a question for you on the top of the next page. And this is the debate. Should we increase the minimum wage, let's say even by $1 an hour to $8.25 an hour in order to try to fight poverty? What do you think about that? How do you feel about that? What's the economics behind that? And as you're thinking about that, I'm going to just make a little list here of the arguments that are in favor of raising the minimum. So those are the pro arguments. And some of the arguments about we shouldn't raise the minimum, those are the con arguments. And so thinking about the story of raising the minimum wage, I'm going to cover those markers here. On the pro side, what's a plus? Well, one plus is definitely we get higher wages or incomes for some workers. So if you're one of those workers that now is going to get paid, $8.25 an hour instead of $7.25, you're going to be, yay, I get more money every week, right? Every hour, every week, every year. One of the trade-offs, of course, in terms of the con to that is that the law of demand holds. So what are employers? Remember that employers are the demanders of labor, and workers or prospective employees are the suppliers of labor. What are employers going to do if they're mandated to pay a higher wage to their workers? They're going to decrease their quantity demanded. And so because of those higher wages, we're going to see a decrease in some jobs, right? Some jobs are going to go bye-bye. employers are going to say, I'm going to have to get rid of some jobs. What might they do? They might, just to kind of put a bullet down here, they might mechanize, right? Replace some workers that are entry level, low skill with some machines that can do the same tasks. Hey, if I'm mandated by law to pay higher wages, I'll just replace those workers with machinery. Like Karl Marx had even talked about with the theory of capital and the stuff that we talked about earlier in the first week. They might outsource or offshore their jobs, take them global. Say, hey, if you're going to mandate that we pay higher minimum wages here to our workers in the United States, all of a sudden taking that factory, taking that business, taking that operation to some lower wage country becomes more attractive as an alternative, and so we may see some of that as well. We may see people being asked to do more for that higher wage, so that we're going to combine duties, make managers do some of the other tasks, etc., but not pay them any more money to make it work. So some workers are going to lose their jobs. You can see it on the graph right here, right? And let's just say we take the wage from 5 up. Well, let's suppose the wage is, let's just leave it 5, and we raise it to $7.25. We could do the $8.25, $1 higher, like I talked about. But let's just do it here. It's a little easier. When the wage goes up from 5 to $7.25, quantity demanded of labor is decreased. The employers say we're not going to hire as many workers. Those folks lose their jobs. They become, and I hate this term, right? Economists talk like this sometimes, but they become disemployed. And so that's a big con. Yes, some workers, the workers who keep their jobs, have higher wages and incomes, but some workers lose their jobs and actually makes their economic situation more tenuous. The pertinent question is an empirical one, right? How many people lose their jobs? And the studies about the impact of minimum wages on employment are a little bit mixed. Most of them say, this is a general summary, that in the short run, when the minimum wage is increased, employers talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. In other words, they threaten that they're going to lay off a lot of workers. In reality, they don't. In the short run, it's pretty hard to replace workers doing, fundamental essential duties. So in the short run, that curve is actually, this demand curve is actually pretty steep, and so we don't see a big quantity reduction. However, over time, when those employers have had a chance to adjust and mechanize or outsource or do other sorts of things to refine their production process, then the employment effect is much larger. And so it is a relatively significant effect in the longer term, something of some concern. Okay, so that's the pro and con at the first step. A second pro, you might say, well, gosh, if these folks have more incomes and they go out and spend that, then that makes the whole community better off. And so we have increased incomes for the overall or the whole community. What economists call a second round or a second order effect, right? The workers get more incomes, they go out and spend it. That means more jobs, more income, more demand for the other things that are produced by the grocer and the hardware store owner, etc. And so increases incomes for the whole community. The people against the minimum wage being raised say, yeah, but you know what? That could just be inflationary. Maybe inflationary, because think about it, if most people in the community have more dollars in their pockets, but they actually aren't producing any more real stuff, then those additional dollars don't go any farther. You don't have any more purchasing power. It's simply a matter of an illusion, a magician's illusion, and it's inflationary. So yeah, I've got more dollars, but I can't buy any more stuff. Is that true? Well, only to the extent that when people get paid more, they don't work and produce more. And there's evidence out there that says increased wages lead to increased productivity. Right? Increased wages lead to increased productivity. So if you're going to get paid closer to what you're worth, closer to what you're actually producing, you might show up to work more often, not call in sick when you're not really sick. You might not steal from the boss. You might not sit around and dilly-dally and chat and check Facebook and play iTunes and whatever else while you're supposed to be working, because the stories you feel like you're being valued a little more respected. If that's the case, you're actually producing more things, more goods and services, more stuff. And so in other words, that higher wage is justified. You're worth it if you get paid more and you produce more. So to the extent that we have higher productivity, it doesn't have to be inflationary, because we're producing more real stuff, not just higher prices. Okay? What are some other arguments here that we should think about? Well, I didn't talk about this earlier, but let's chat about it now. Not all workers are covered by the minimum wage laws in this country. Obviously, professionals like myself are not covered by the minimum wage laws. I'm not paid hourly, and so the story is I'm not subject to the laws. But I'm not really going to be impacted by this, right? Because my salary is significantly higher than this particular hourly wage. Having said that, there are people in entry-level positions who are not covered by the minimum wage law, and there's some impact there. Agricultural workers, for example, right? Workers on the farms. We have workers who are in-home health aides for the disabled and the elderly who take care of those folks in their homes, for example. They're not covered by the minimum wage laws. Newspaper delivery persons, babysitters, others are not covered by these minimum wage laws. And so you're like, well, Ron, why did you tell me that, right? A lot of workers are covered today, much more so than originally, but still a lot aren't. And so the impact is to say, well, what happens to their wages when these workers lose their jobs, right? The red here, the folks who are disemployed, where do they go? And the answer is, well, they spill over, right, into the uncovered sector. So if we had an uncovered sector supply and demand model, right, here's the wage for the uncovered sector and the quantity of workers. If we have a spillover, the workers that lost their jobs here now want to supply their labor wherever they can get income, and that tends to push down the wage in the uncovered sector. So we see lower wages in the uncovered sector of the economy, and those folks have worse situation, even more challenging times getting jobs that are already not paying very well. Got a couple more for us to think about, and then we'll wrap this up and talk about price ceilings. One thing to think about is that a lot of workers who are working minimum wage jobs are young, under the age of 20. And in fact, that number is a little bit less than half of workers are somewhere around 20 or less in age. Those workers are, for the most part, not trying to fully support themselves. They may be college students or high school students or what have you. And so the majority of them are trying to work these minimum wage jobs just to earn a little income, and perhaps more importantly, to develop basic skills. Customer service skills, being reliable, showing up to work every day, learning how to do those fundamental things that we all need to learn to do. And so the argument is that if you raise the minimum, the workers who are most likely to be let go are the ones who are the least needed in that particular sense. So what you effectively do, the argument against it goes, is you cut off that lowest rung of the ladder, right? So you have fewer opportunities to get that first job, to learn those fundamental skills that are then later in life going to help you get successively more responsible, more important employment. Not that this stuff isn't important. I don't mean it that way at all. I definitely worked some minimum wage jobs back when the minimum wage was $3.15 an hour. You worked at a plastics factory doing the graveyard shift. I did some jobs that were below minimum wage. I was a paper boy for many years. A lot of that stuff, right? And so the story is those jobs taught me the things that helped me to later on succeed and get ever more progressively responsible positions. Okay, so that's an argument that some people put up here as well. And there's one last one that's really actually very important. and that is that there's the ability to discriminate. So discrimination, and the side effect of that is oftentimes that there's an incentive for bribery, some really perverse incentives here. And I want to explain that one by looking at this picture. What you see in the picture here is that at the minimum, 725 in this example, we have a surplus of labor. More people want to supply their labor and work than will be demanded by the employers. So there's this many people. The difference between my fingers here, this surplus of workers that are searching for those jobs but can't land one. So what does that mean? Well, it means if you're the employer and you're only letting this number of people get hired, this quantity demanded right here, but this many people are knocking at the door, if for some reason you harbor in your heart prejudice against a particular group, I don't like Chicago Cubs fans, it's a fact. Or, you know, I don't like people of a certain skin color, which is not the truth for me, but obviously some people feel that way. Or based on age, or sexual orientation, or religious beliefs, or what have you. The story is that if you're holding the strings on those jobs, you can say, well, somebody knocks on the door and says you have a job. Oh, not for you, right? But you don't have to justify it because there's a lot of other people knocking, and you can just pick who you want to have. The law says you can't discriminate based on those characteristics, but we know that it happens. And because the price is too high and there's this surplus, the employers can be picky. Along those lines, if you're one of these workers or these prospective employees and you want a job, why not bribe the boss and say, hey, I'll do you some favors. I'll bake some meals for you. I'll do other favors, whatever. You can use your imagination in order to try to get one of those coveted positions. And so the unofficial, behind the scenes, shadow black markets, what have you, develop, and we get all kinds of perverse incentives. And so if we were at the equilibrium price, the market price down here, where quantity demand equals quantity supply, there's no shortage and there's no surplus. And so that ability to discriminate or the incentive to bribe is eliminated. But when it's artificially held high, it is all over the place, and that is a real problem. Okay. So the last little part of this is to look at question there on number 4, which says we'd all like to have higher incomes and see everybody have higher incomes with less poverty. Every economist I know, myself included, really do not want to have people in poverty with low incomes. And the question we ask is, how do we get there in the best way? Is the minimum wage a good long-term solution to fighting poverty? And I think the answer is clearly no. Does that mean that I'm against the minimum wage? Not necessarily. I think that the minimum wage has a place, and it helps people that really are dependent upon, you know, decent wages if they can get a job to maybe achieve that. But there are better long-run solutions. Okay. In many ways, I think about the minimum wage as a band-aid to stop a, you know, bleeding patient. It might stem the flow for a while, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem. And so to solve the underlying problem, we need to do something a little differently. In fact, if you think about it, look at the graph that you have there, and I want you, where it says our goal is to increase wages and get more people employed. Our goal is to get out here compared to what we would have down here. We want higher wages and we want more employment. And so how do we get out here with the market graph? And the answer is our goal is to shift the demand for labor, right, out here to D1. Our goal, if you're filling in the blanks, is to shift the demand to the right to D1. So why don't you take a couple of seconds there, a little bit of time in the graph to label where supply and demand intersect as the market price and quantity, so PM and QM. And then to look at the fact that, you know, we've got that price floor above here, and that's going to lead to a surplus. And so then shift the demand curve. I want you to draw a whole new demand curve out to the right where the price floor and supply intersect. Okay? And the goal is to get more employment with higher wages, higher prices. And then once you've drawn that, look at the question right above the graph. It says, what policies could help us to achieve this goal? How are we going to get employers to demand more of these workers and therefore pay them a higher wage and hire more of them? And if you just said education, you're right. If you just said more training opportunities, you're right. Because why are employers going to demand more workers? Why are they going to be willing to hire more and pay more? And the answer is if they're worth more. I'll pay more to workers if they produce more for me. If they're better educated and more efficient and they're better trained and better skilled, then the answer is yeah. So you guys are all investing in your education to try to get to a point where you can have better opportunities and higher wages. And if we did that for the whole economy, the story is that we would lead to less poverty, higher real incomes because we're producing more, and that would be a win-win situation. So the long-run goal is to work with the market, to have the government create incentives like things like Pell Grants, so students can afford to go to college better. To think about things like retraining programs to help people achieve their goals and their abilities. All those things shift the demand for labor to the right and justify higher wages with more employment. One moral of the story, and it says it at the bottom of your sheet there, is that usually, not always, but usually when we put on these artificial rules, like price floors or price ceilings, the story is that people aren't stupid. People find an end around, right? They discriminate or they bribe or they do all kinds of other things, and we lead to an outcome that's not optimal from a private or social perspective. Rather, the moral of the story is rather than setting up these artificial rules and trying to fight the market, work with the market. Have the government change incentives where people have, more Pell Grants or better financial aid or whatever, more training opportunities, and then let them chase after their dreams. And when you do that and you let the supply and demand forces of the market interact, we lead to a better outcome. That's an important moral of the story. The forces of the market are just that. They are forces. And so we lead to a better situation. Okay? All right. So that's the story of price floors. Let me erase all this beautiful stuff. And we're going to talk about price ceilings just a little bit. Before we do that, you guys know what you call a fish with no eye? Simple joke, but I can't like it. Anyway, so we're going to talk about the second situation where governments intervene and decide that they don't like the market price. And that's when they establish what are known as price ceilings. And you guessed it, the name is rather descriptive, right? So if we're going to put a definition down here, the ceiling is as high as we can go. So a price ceiling is a maximum price allowed by law. Maximum price allowed by law. I can be below the ceiling, which I am right now, but I can't be above it, right? That's the upper bound. It's as high as I can go. So it's a maximum price allowed by law. And there's several examples out there. One that may have immediately popped into your head, if you're a sports fan, pro sports fan, is salary caps, right? There's a cap that you can't pay any more than that as a team, and all that kind of stuff. So that's a good example of a price ceiling. We're going to talk about an example called rent controls in this class in detail because it's a great example of the challenges with price ceilings. Rent controls. Also, you could talk about, I don't have 3 blanks there, but you can talk about wage and price controls. Rent controls, wage and price controls. Wage and price controls are things that have been used in our country, particularly in times of war. So the idea has been that, during times of war, when we're in a national, emergency, a national sense of preparedness and fighting, that we need to kind of keep things going. And so rather than letting prices escalate, inflation to occur, the government has oftentimes said, we're just going to freeze wages and prices. We're not going to let them go up by law. And of course, what happens when that develops is some really weird things. We're going to look at those really weird things in just a second. The last time we had wage and price controls was not during it. Well, it was during a time of war, but it was during the Vietnam era, actually, and President Nixon was in office. Inflation was getting bad. We were fighting that nasty war in Vietnam. And so President Nixon declared wage and price freeze. We'll see what happened when he did that in just a second. It was not pretty. So what happens when there's a price ceiling established on a market? And the answer is it depends, right? It depends upon where that ceiling is relative to the market price. So here's the first graph, which you already have on your sheet. What I want you to do is, where supply and demand intersect, I want you to label that as the free market price and quantity, so PM and QM. And then let's suppose that the government says, well, we're going to put on a cap or a ceiling down here. So that tells us that by law, the price can't go above that green line. And if the price can't go above that green line, what develops in this market, of course, is a shortage. Because at that really low price, the quantity supplied under the ceiling, right, is less than the quantity people would like to get their hands on at that really low price. So the quantity demanded is way out here, but the quantity supplied is back on the supply curve at that ceiling price. And so we have a shortage development. How big is the shortage if you're filling in the second blank? Well, it's Q ceiling demanded minus the amount supplied at that price. In a free market, the shortage will go away. But the law says it can't because it's made permanent by the law. Price can't go up to PM, which is the free market solution. The price is kept artificially low at the ceiling, and so we have a institutionalized or shortage made permanent. Okay? So whenever we cap the prices or put a ceiling on below the market equilibrium, a shortage develops. Turn to the next page, and we'll say, well, what if the ceiling is above the market equilibrium? What if we have a situation that looks like this? Again, please label the intersection of supply and demand as the market price and quantity, PM and QM. And then suppose that the ceiling happens to be up here. That by law, you can't charge a price above that green line. What's the actual price going to be here? PC? No, it's not, right? Because it's not mandated that you have to pay a price up here. You just can't charge a price or pay a price above that. You could be down here at PM. So if this is the rent control example, and the market says that the going rent is $600 a month, and the law says, well, you can't charge more than $1,500, what's the rent going to be? $600. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to be binding. It won't have any effect. So if you're circling the answers, when the ceiling is above the market equilibrium, it creates no shortage or surplus. Market is unaffected. And the actual price and quantity in this case will be the market price, PM, and the market quantity, QM. It won't have any teeth. Caps or ceilings only have teeth when they're below what the market wants the price to be. Okay? So I want to look at a specific application, which is rent controls. And to do that, let me get rid of some of this stuff on the board. And some of you are like, do we have rent controls in Wisconsin? And the answer is no, not really, right? But they are very common and have historically been very common in the United States, particularly in the big cities on the east and west coasts. New York is a classic example, San Francisco as well. a bunch of cities did these, and they really started in our country after World War II. A lot of GIs who had been fighting, obviously, in Europe and Asia and all that, came back, and they had a hard time finding affordable housing. And so what a lot of politicians said was, well, we want the GIs to have a place to live that they can afford, and so they put on these rent controls, these caps on rent, and it was really popular. Obviously, the GIs liked it. They won votes for the politicians won votes for those policies, and so the politicians said, "Ooh, maybe we should extend it, right, to a lot of people, particularly people in the low-income categories." And you know, it's a noble goal. Everybody wants to have more affordable housing. I absolutely favor that goal. I'm sure you do as well. The question, from an economics perspective, is what's the best way to get there? Are rent controls the best way to keep affordable housing a reality, or to make affordable housing a reality? And the answer is no. That doesn't mean they're all bad, but I want to think about the challenges that we face. So let's again think about the arguments in favor of keeping rent controls in place and the arguments against rent control policies. And so what's the main argument in favor of it? What's the main pro argument? Yeah, more affordable rents, right? So we got lower rents. For some people. So if you're one of the lucky ones that gets one of those rent-controlled apartments, there's some funny video clips on this, YouTube clips from Seinfeld and other places you can look at some of this stuff. But lower rents for some people. And that was the goal of the program, was to make affordable housing a reality. That's really the only pro. But it's a big pro, right? It's good for those folks. But what happens on the con side? Well, what happens on the con side is that there's going to be a shortage, right? Shortage of rent-controlled units at that price. You can see that over here in this graph. That the demand for those units by prospective tenants is way out here, but the quantity supplied by the landlords is way back there. So we get a shortage. There's not enough to go around. And when that happens, lots of interesting things develop. For example, one thing, what happens if you're in one of these rent-controlled buildings and something minor breaks? You know, the faucet keeps dripping a little bit. You know, the door handle on one of the interior doors, you know, doesn't lock the way that it used to. You know, there's a couple of holes in the carpeting or those kind of things. And you pick up the phone or you get your cell phone out and you call your landlord and say, "Hey, Joe, you know, can you come and help me? I've got these problems." Joe's going to say, "Oh, nice talking to you. Thanks for calling. Have a great day," and hang up. Because the story is, when Joe is faced with those, you know, minor things that, you know, are a problem in the apartment, he's going to say, "Well, why should I put my money in there? I can't get the return on my investment that I could in some other part of town." And so what tends to happen is the quality of the apartments deteriorates. Decrease in the quality. They tend to fall apart, relatively speaking, somewhat, because if you're going to tell me I can only get this return on my product, I'm going to lessen the quality commensurate with that lower return. So that happens. What else happens here? Well, there's the ability to discriminate again, and the incentive to bribe. Discrimination and bribery. Discrimination and bribery. Look at this, right? At this rent-controlled price, lots of people want to get in. That's the quantity demanded. But the only units that are available is back here. So what do we have? Shortage. The landlords say, "This is how many apartments I have. If I don't like you, when you say, 'Hey, knock, 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 I would like to rent an apartment from you,' we don't have any. Just because I didn't like the fact that you're a Chicago Cubs fan or you're a particular group. The story is I don't have an apartment." So even though by law you're not supposed to be able to do that, we know what happens. It's a very serious story. And why not, if you're one of these people looking for one of these buildings or one of these apartments, to say, "Hey, I'll do something for you. You know, I'll slip a couple extra $100 every month in an unmarked envelope under your door. Let me have the apartment. I'll bake those chocolate chip cookies. I'll do other favors for you. And so there's a lot of perverse incentives here. Not what the law intended, but what people are going to do. People aren't stupid. People are motivated by self-interested behavior. And the story is when the government puts on this rule and it gets the market away from its fundamentals, people do an end around, right? People do an end around. They're not stupid. So discrimination and bribery, very ugly story. Other things, you hear stories like the market rent might have been capped at, let's say, $1,000 a month. The ceiling would be 1,000, and the market, wants it to be, 2,000. So what would happen? Well, oftentimes the landlord would say, you can have the apartment, right? It's yours. But if you want a key to get into the apartment, it's going to cost you an extra $600 a month. You want a parking space? $400 extra a month. You want, right? Hot water turned on? It's gonna, right? And so the story is that even though the law says you can only charge that amount per month and no more, they didn't say anything. I can't charge for the key, or that I can't do that. And so we see all of these really perverse. It's crazy. It's absolute craziness. But that is the system of perverse incentives that price controls, particularly price ceilings for rental units, oftentimes create. Another thing that happens here is black markets. And most economists as well prefer the term today shadow markets, but you'll still hear the term black markets a lot. So shadow markets or black markets. Shadow markets or black markets are informal markets, not necessarily illegal. A lot of people say they're illegal. They're not always illegal. But the story is that they're a secondary market. They're a market behind the scenes where people actually trade in things as to what they're really worth, right? And so if we've got this artificial problem of the ceilings, the price being too low, what happens? Well, the story is that what's the maximum that people would be willing to pay to rent these units? Look at that quantity and read up to the demand curve. Because the demand curve tells us the maximum willingness to pay. What's it worth to you for that second bottle of Liney's Red? What's somebody willing to pay for that last rental unit? And so what happens is, if you're one of those people that has a rent-controlled building or rent-controlled apartment, and you're paying, let's say, $1,000 a month, but the value of that rental unit in the market, right, specifically for that person who's willing to pay that much, is, let's say, $2,000 a market. What do you do with it if you don't really want to live there, if you don't need to live there? Well, you sublet it, right? And you take the extra $1,000 and you apply it against your mortgage for a nice McMansion in the suburbs. That's how these laws work, is the story of these situations work, is that if you are in a rent-controlled building, mom and dad might have been really low income, and so they qualified for rent control. And then those rights were oftentimes transferable to their offspring. And so if Junior or Sissy or whoever, the kid, was in that rent-controlled building but became a doctor or a lawyer or economist or somebody, and they said, I don't really want to live in this building in this particular neighborhood, but they didn't want to give up the rent control rights because it was lucrative, they'd say, hey, I'm going to take and I'm going to sublet it to somebody for $2,000 a month. I'm going to pay that required rent of $1,000. I'm going to take the extra $1,000 and I'm going to apply it against my mortgage in that nice home in the suburbs. That's not what this law intended, but that's what happens. Black or shadow markets develop all the time. The problem is that people want more than they can get at that price, and they'll find a way to get it, and that means that the price can be much higher along those lines. During times of war, with wage and price freezes, persistent shortages. People couldn't get their hands on basic items, eggs and meat, sugar and alcohol and milk and whatever. And so what would develop would be black markets, shadow markets, where people would trade on the streets to get stuff and charge exorbitant prices because that's what the market would bear. It's not illegal necessarily, but the story, sometimes it is, but the story is that people are motivated by self-interest, and these artificial prices create those incentives. One last con argument here as to a challenge with rent controls, and that is to ask you what happens to rents in the non-rent controlled part of town. So the non-rent controlled part of town, right? Here was the market rent originally. And then what happens when rent controls develop over here? Well, we see a decrease in the number of units that are available, right? Lost rental opportunities, right? In the rent controlled part of town. So they spill over, right, into the non-rent controlled. They're demanding more units in that other part of town. What happens to rents over there? They get pushed up. So the last one to jot down here is that because of that spillover, we actually see higher rents in non-rent controlled parts of town. The goal of this law was to make more affordable housing a reality. For these folks, it actually made affordable housing less of a reality, less of a chance, because we got higher rents in those non-rent controlled parts of town. Okay, so rent control is not necessarily, in fact, it's not the best way long term to make affordable housing a reality. Turn to page 13 if you would. Everybody wants to have affordable housing. Is there a better way, better long-term way to try to do it? The answer is absolutely yes. When you put on these controls, these caps, you're doing a system, you're putting in artificial constraints. You're not letting the market work. You're fighting the forces of the marketplace. And again, there's a moral to be learned here. When you fight the market, you tend to lose. If you can change the incentives and then work with the market, that tends to be the way to go. So how are we going to get, if you think about it here, we want to get out here, right? Because at this point, we have, relative to the free market, we have lower rents and we have more units available. So more affordable housing and at lower prices. So what we want to do, really, working with the market, is we want to shift the supply of these units out here to S1. So on your graph there, you want to shift that supply curve so that it intersects where demand and the ceiling intersect, which is down here, because we have more units at a lower price. So it'd be a shift of the supply to the right. How could we do that? What policies might get us there? We're filling in the blank above the graph. What policies might help us achieve that goal? Well, we've got to get the suppliers of rental units, the landlords and the developers and all the rest, to be willing and able to produce more of those units in certain parts of town. So we need to incentivize it. So maybe it's tax breaks for developments in certain parts of town to get them to provide more low-cost units. Maybe it's regulations, right, requiring more units. Low-cost units, etc. All of these policies, which are trying to incentivize the development of more low-cost units, of course, are challenging in the real world. Because if they're not universally applied, if not every city in the state and in the country does this, then what's going to happen is that if one city requires more low-cost units and that's going to be a lower profit, then the developer says, well, just move to a different suburb and build there. And then that doesn't really relieve the problem. So it's a challenging thing. Madison has tried these, tax incremental districts and tax breaks and all of that, and we still have a problem of affordable housing in the city of Madison, like most cities around this country. The theory is clear here that we want to work with supply. The practice is challenging indeed, and so those are just a couple of ideas of how we might get there. The devil is in the details, and we need to chat about that and keep working on it. Okay. One last comment while I'm thinking about it here about price ceilings, and that is that oftentimes when we have a natural disaster in our country or globally, like a few years ago, Hurricane Katrina or what have you, the story, or Superstorm Sandy, a lot of politicians call for freezing prices so that we don't have gouging going on, where businesses charge higher prices because they know demand is high for people to get materials to rebuild their lives, for plywood and other lumber and roofing shingles and all of that kind of stuff, building materials, and what have you. Tools to cut down the fallen trees and all of that. And when we do that, when we pass these laws that say, well, you can't charge more than X number of dollars per sheet of plywood, what actually happens is that the recovery from that nasty storm, that natural disaster, is a lot slower than if we would let the market work. Now, the trick is that low-income folks are going to be at a disadvantage, and that's the way capitalism is, and that's a problem indeed. And so how do we balance all of that? That's really the topic of economics, and it's a challenge because there's no easy answer. It's not always a win-win. We have to make a judgment value outside of economics, right? A normative economic statement. You have to decide, and I do too, what we want our world to look like, but we need to know the arguments. If we're going to be a strong contributor to opinion and a strong contributor to other people's thinking, we need to know the arguments on both sides so we can eloquently voice our ideas and advocate for what we want the world to look like. And that's a value of economics. Okay? One last little topic here, and then we will wrap up this week's video lectures, and that is to apply the price ceiling and floor stuff to the Liney's red market graph on the next page. So if you can turn there, just want to do this because I found in the past if I haven't done this particular exercise, students can't always calculate surpluses and shortages and what have you. I just want to make sure. So we'll do this quickly. But if you look at the graph there, I've replicated the market for Liney's red graph that we did at the end of last week. And so the market wants the price to be $6, right? Where supply and demand intersect, and they want the equilibrium quantity to be 900 6-bottle packs. That's where supply and demand intersect. Question 1 says, well, what if the government comes in here and they put on a price floor of $8? So by law, the price can't go below that floor of $8. What's going to develop here? Well, what's going to develop is a surplus. And the way you read it from the graph, this is what I'm really focusing on in this little bit, is that look up at $8 as the price and read over horizontally to the right. And you'll see that at $8, quantity demanded is 450. But at $8, if you read over to the supply, quantity supplied is 1,200. That's a surplus. And the surplus is the difference between the 1,200 supplied and the 450 quantity demanded at $8. So it's a surplus of 750 6-bottle packs of Liney's red. So when the floor is above the market equilibrium, there's a surplus, and that's how you calculate it. For question 2, suppose instead that the floor is at $4. So by law, the price can't go below $4. What happens in this case? That's right, nothing happens in this case. There's no shortage or surplus because the law says you can't have a price below 4, but the market says we want the price to be 6. And so the actual market price will be $6 here for that next blank, and 900 6-bottle packs will be bought and sold. Okay? So when a floor is below the market equilibrium, it doesn't do anything. And 2 more. If there's a government and they set on a price ceiling, a cap of $4, what happens? So by law, the price can't go above $4. What develops in this market? We'll look at the graph and look at $4 for the price and read over horizontally to the right. And you'll see that at $4, quantity supplied by the brewer would only be 600. But the quantity demanded at $4, so again, read over at $4 till it hits the demand curve, is 1,350. That's how many 6-bottle packs people want, but only 600 are going to get produced. So there's a shortage, and the shortage is the difference between the two. So 1,350 minus 600, which is 750 6-bottle packs. So when we cap the prices artificially low, we develop indeed a shortage. And then for the last one, suppose that the ceiling is up at 8. By law, the price can't go above 8. And what happens here? Nothing. That's right. Because the market wants the price to be 6. So a price of 8 doesn't distort. It doesn't do anything. And so the actual equilibrium price will be $6. The market will win, and the equilibrium quantity will be 900. You don't have to charge 8. You just can't charge any more than 8. 6 is less than 8. No harm, no foul, no problem. So price ceiling only has an effect when it's below the equilibrium. It doesn't do anything when it's above. So in this section, in this episode, we've talked about situations where the government doesn't like the price, the society doesn't like the free market price, and we put on either a cap or a floor, a ceiling or a floor, to try to deal with that. And we've looked at the economic implications of doing so. That's the end of this week's video lectures. Next week, we'll turn our attention to looking at a question of elasticity, which answers the question of how much. So just real quick, if we're talking about Leinenkugels red lager and the price increases, we know quantity demanded decreases, right? Ceteris paribus. But we didn't answer the important question of how much. So you better know that if you're running a business. If I raise the price of my product 10%, am I going to lose 1% of sales? Am I going to lose 5%, 10%, 20%? You better know, right? Because it's going to have huge impact on your pricing decision, on your ability to earn profits, and all the rest. So we'll talk about elasticity of demand, elasticity of supply, and some other measures of that next time. Until then, have a great day, have a great week, and we'll be in touch.